I came to laugh at you.
Reactor online. Sensors online. Weapons online. All systems nominal.
Alright, today we've got Best Boy painted up based on the MechWarrior Online design. This looks very Zaku, very nice. I believe this should be a BL6 variant, but for Char, technically it should probably be a BL9 since it has the upgraded engine and the ERPPC, which is as close as I think we can get in this universe to the Hyper Bazooka that Char seems to have a fetish for throughout this series. Now this was a resin print that I got from an Etsy shop from my last video when I was going over my bundle from there. Technically it was the shop I got from, and it was a pretty good quality. If you type in MechWarrior Online, Battletech, Black Knight, there'll be probably about 6 different people who will be selling it, so you can take your pick from that. And originally I wasn't sure who made the design for this one, but I was able to find it on STL Finder. If I can find it again, I'll plug it in the description, at least for this variation. It seems like people were pulling the meshes, I believe, from MechWarrior Online and kind of customizing and making their own mechs that way, which is pretty neat. And this one specifically, I was just trying to go outside the box and create a unique lance based on something that I liked in particular. There are plenty of houses and things like that. I think I might do a Star League lance after this, as well as a Federation to fight the Zeon threat as well. But part of this was also an experimentation with red, because I always try to play around with colors and see if I can find something that looks really good, but it's a lot simpler to do. And this wasn't a, how should I say, an experiment for the future endeavors into expanding my Bloodraven army. So let's go over this and document it so I can remember, since I'm getting to have the memory of a goldfish, and if anybody else finds it useful, that'll work too. Well, we started out with our basic resin model. It didn't need too much cleaning up. There was some excess points where the supports came out that needed a bit nubbing down. My problem with 3D printing, and this might be more of the file depending on the 3D printer, there's always these ridges. Sometimes they're really thin, sometimes they're really thick, and you have to get a really thin sandpaper, really fine sandpaper, because you don't want to destroy the details. I usually use about somewhere between 1600 2000, so kind of a polishing sandpaper to try to nub it down so it looks good, at least on the top side. There's still some ribbings, especially on the head right around here. I think the dry brushing caught some in the front there, but from a distance it's barely noticeable. The camera negs it, but to the human eye you won't really be able to see it too much, so I did polish it down to an extent. There are some kind of polygonal shapes we might be able to see on the shoulder and some of the other parts, but for the most part we sanded it down okayly. Now for the primer, most people when they do red, they'll either do just a red primer, or they'll do a black primer, or they'll do a gray primer. Well, I went with black-brown, because normally I'll do a black and then I'll do a highlight of a dark brown, but this one is all in one. It's a very nice looking color. And I think when I was taking the picture of this guy, the saturation of the light was too high, so we'll take a picture of a guardsman in these colors and you'll get an idea of why I like this color. Now it's from the Pro Acro line, which I don't think a lot of people have heard of, but it's actually quite a decent paint. They also make the same color as the primer and little paint bottles too, so you can do touches up if you want. And if you've ever heard of Tabletop Minions, I believe the fellow there actually has a promo code to get off on some of these supplies. Works pretty well. I forgot exactly what it was, but there is some neat stuff on there. They actually have glass mixing beads for your paint. So those, and they're really cheap, like $1 for like 100 of them, so it wasn't that bad of a deal. Forgot how much these paints were, but they weren't overtly expensive. I like the primer. I also got a dark green, which is more of a green-gray, and a dark gray. They're all pretty good colors, so I haven't had time to use the gray, but I'm really going a mile on the black-brown here. Now I was trying to see how red would go over the brown, so I started with something a little dark. We started with dark red. Now this is the Vallejo model color. Traditionally in my Blood Ravens I used the Mecha color, dark red, which is slightly different but as close as I could possibly get to dark red. This one's slightly brighter, that one's slightly darker. The Mecha color is supposed to be for Gundam building. It's supposed to be more durable paint, so it doesn't come off as much when you're posing. I didn't really notice that too much, but supposedly it is. But this color was still too dark, and if we notice on Char's mobile suit, depending on the variation, it's either, from the original series, it looks kind of pink, or on some of the models, it's more of a bright red. So, the next coat we sprayed over that was dark vermilion, which I found to be the perfect shade of red for Char. But after that, we needed a highlight, and that's a pretty bright shade of red. You can't really go too much brighter than that. That's a pure crimson right there. So, but as we noticed, that Char usually has a pinkish tint to his mobile suit. So Old Rose would have been a nice choice after that. But I didn't do pure Old Rose because I thought it may have been too bright. So what we did is we mixed about... At first I did about 50-50, but the Old Rose was just drinking a dark vermilion. There wasn't too much change in it, so I had to do about 75 to about 25 Old Rose. So we got a nice pinkish tinge to it, but it wasn't too overwhelming. What I did after that is I dry brushed with a makeup brush. These things are fantastic. Every time I see someone come out with their paintbrush set and it's like $15 per brush and they're just some kind of Games Workshop variation where they overspent on their brushes. When he considers a dry brush, it's going to get his butt kicked pretty fast. And these are about $1 at your local convenience store, and they really will last a long time. These things are built to put on makeup, so paint is nothing new here. And they really, really work. They're really, really light, really, really bristly, really, really easy to clean. So after that, we'll notice that Char's mobile suit isn't just one color, there's multiple. And near his chest plate, there also is a darker red. So right around the top part variation and the bottom plates where the extended armor comes out, I did a burnt red, which I think matched the color of the mobile suit perfectly. And then we'll notice it has gray parts as well. The gray parts I did with German gray. Now this gray is interesting. This is one you really have to shake it a lot, because if you don't, the liquid will come out as black and it'll look like it's paint, but it's really not. This is technically a gray that is so black, it's 1 or 2 tones removed from black. It's a very nice one. And after that, I did the entire model in a wash, and I used Carroburg Crimson, but I didn't do it alone. What I did is I added some glaze medium. I did some experiments a little back with the, Lamian medium. That works kind of okay. It helps keep the surface tension that you would probably lose and create some weird pigmentation if you just used water, but it's still a bit too watery and runny. I usually use glaze medium if I use a wash for 2 reasons. One, it breaks it up kind of nicely. Sometimes it adds a bit of matte so it's not overtly shiny. And at the same time, there's supposedly a drying retarder in a glaze medium. And what that does is it gives you extra time to wick off the shade so it doesn't pool in places you don't want it to pool. And the second important part is when I apply it, I make sure that the brush is damp beforehand. I don't actually put a pure dry brush on there. It tends to turn out looking kind of weird and patchy. If you ever see people's models when they post them on Reddit and they look really patchy and dank and dirty, you know they put a wash on there, but it looks just unnaturally dirty. I find if you use a dampened brush beforehand, it helps reduce that as well. Now the thing is, the ratio I probably use on this, it's probably 75 wash, probably 80 wash to 20% glaze. You don't want to put too much glaze in there because it'll, especially if you don't mix it really well, it'll cause cloudiness on your model. Like if you put too much varnish on it, it'll look like that, and you don't want that. So less, I would go with less on this, and it turns out pretty well. Now the convenient part on this is that I could use one side for applying and then another damp side to try to wick away the ends. So I was just flipping back and forth like that, and it turned out pretty good. As there's no patchy wash spots on there, it blended in the pink dry brush with the red. So it turned out quite nice, and it gave me that higher level of red I was looking for without, well, trying to mix too much further with the paints. Now, you would think when you put the red wash over it that the gray would get some of that red on there. To an extent it might, but you can always go back over that, because what I did on the next stage after that is I went over it with darker gray as I was experimenting with some faux metal, and especially on the mobile suits in the anime, they have that kind of, they're not really metallic, they're just shades of gray. So I thought this was a good attempt, because non-metallic metals is beautiful. If you've ever seen people who do that, they look fantastic. They look so much better than just using regular metallics. And then after that, I'll just tone up a little bit more of neutral gray. And for that bright streak, we'll just do a white gray. It's very simple at this scale. It's not overtly elaborate because it's not something I'm proficient at, but it's a start. It's something that I thought fit the vibe of the model we were going for. Now, as for the highlighting of the darker red part, I just used some flat red. It worked out quite nicely. Now, for the freehand parts, I found that the last time I really did freehand was actually for Blood Raven's Captain, the special edition one for the Space Marine Heroes, and it turned out okay. So my freehand it's kind of crap. But I found if you have an idea of what the design is supposed to be, if you get a micron pen and try to doodle it on, it kind of helps guide you into position. I did that part for the BL6 on there, even though it kind of went a little bit small on there. It did turn out better than the places that I didn't do it on, like the A12 and the Zeon symbol. Now the problem with the Zeon symbol, it's a bit crooked, because I was painting it, I had the urge to paint it straight up, but his knee is kind of locked to the side. It's slightly crooked, but not so much that it would be such a problem with. And the only part that I actually did a micron pen was the circle. Everything else I tried to etch out. And the interesting thing about freehanding is you can always go back over the base undercoat if you do too much white or anything like this. I had to do that to try to get some of the pinpoints out. Just go back over it with gray, so it turned out at least looking like the Zeon symbol. And I believe pretty much the last part would be the eye. The eye I did a base coat of a violet red, and then I just did a drop of old rose, and then I'd watered down some violet red and put it right over the front, so it blended the parts together so it didn't seem like a blob of pink on top of purple. It had a bit of a glowy vibe to it. And I added a little bit of effects to it. Now, usually when you see pictures of mechs and Battletechs, normally when you see the lasers on a battle mech, they're usually convex. But on here, they're concave. If they're convex, I would probably have put a white little dot and then put some translucent paint so it seemed like it was glowing. I put a deep green dabs on all the medium lasers and then a Prussian blue on the PPC just to make it stand out a little bit more. Now the last part is to seal it with some varnish. I use the Mecha varnish, matte varnish. I love me some matte finish. Now, there's multiple ways you can apply varnish. And this is one stage you can really mess up your model. I've seen a lot of people in their online tutorials painting stuff, they just take a whole bit of it and go, oh, just slap it on there. And it's the same problem with the washes. You don't slap it on there. Don't slap. It's something that requires a little bit of practice if you do, especially if you do it brush-wise, because if you put too much on there, it'll get really hazy and foggy and it'll look horrible. Technically, you might be able to fix it by covering it with a gloss varnish, potentially. It might reduce it a bit, but it'll still look kind of funny. If you water it down too much, what happens is that it'll actually act completely like a wash, and it'll go into the crevices in dry, and it'll look like a crusty white powder everywhere. It'll look like you went full bukkake on it. It's not an anime statue. You don't want to go full bukkake on the battle mech. The other way you can apply it, and the way I like to apply it, is through an airbrush. Now, technically this stuff is pretty thick. You're going to have to thin it down. The way I do it is thin it down slightly more than you would thin down a paint. And when you do it fast and precise. You don't want to have to do any more sprays than you want to, because what might happen is, if you didn't thin it down enough, it's going to sputter because it's so thick, and when it sputters, it'll shoot little white dots all over your model, and it'll look like you really bukkake'd it. You don't want that. You can still technically get those off because it is water soluble, so if you get a wet brush, even when it dries a bit on those white spots, you can usually pick them off, and you can always touch it up with a little bit of paint and go back over it just one more time. But when I do it is just go over it one quick coat. When you see the shininess dull, you know you got it and you know it's good. Don't touch it, especially afterwards, because if you do that, you'll get little scrape marks in the varnish. You'll get these white little nasty streaks everywhere. It'll make it look even worse. But just one quick spray, side, side, side. When the color tones down, you know you got it, and then you're done. Now, here comes the critical part. I like to go over and think, what could I have done better? This is for future me. Rawr, there, big sexy. I could have probably sanded it slightly better in some areas, because the little ridges, even though they're not apparent from far away, the camera gets them right on the top. They kind of annoy me. Kind of look like Klingon ridges. And the dry brush caught some of those on the front there, but for the most part, most of them are invisible, and I'm kind of surprised by that. I thought they were going to be a bit more prominent, especially when the wash got put on there. Could have done a slight extreme highlight with the rose pink around the top parts right there, and did an extreme highlight on there. I think that would have looked a little bit better. I just got to practice with the non-metal metallics. I really want to get good at that, and not there yet, but every little project will be some much needed experience as we go forward to that. But otherwise, it turned out pretty well. I mean, it's a battle mech. I'm not expecting to be a Rembrandt or hanging in the Sistine Chapels, but I'm pretty happy with it. Yeah, if the next one that I would be working on to add to the Lance would be... Yeah, the next one I would have to work on to the Lance would be Mr.Ral, and he's going to be this nice little Red Reaper right here, variation. So he's going to be a nice blue fit in contrast to Char. I was thinking about what I would put in with the rest of them. I was thinking about going full Black Knight and just adding two more in Zaku form. One would be green, one would be the Desert Tan to accompany them. Or maybe doing two Cyclopses as Zaku 1s. It's hard to say. I was thinking about doing Tri-Stars, but I'm not exactly sure what I would put as them. A Centaurian, maybe? I was thinking about doing a King Crab as a Quebly. Might be interesting. But I was also thinking about what I'm actually going to do for Federation, because what exactly would fit as a Gundam? Because the only things that technically kind of look like the Gundam would be the Phoenix Hawk, but I think that might be a little light. And then there's the Hatamoto Chi, which I think might be a little heavy for the Gundam, but it's something to think about. And I think that's all I have for right about now.